Well, welcome to another edition of the Grazing Sheep podcast. I'm your host, Big Tom Perkins, along with Dr. Cameron Meyerly. And Cam's been teaching an advanced sheep and goat nutrition school, or nutrition class, I guess it is. And I attended that. Since I don't have any advanced sheep, it's not going to do a lot of good for me, I'm afraid.
Right.
I just
Yeah,
have regular sheep.
yeah, and I certainly can't take credit for it, and wasn't even my idea in the first place. But uh, Melanie Barkley, there, a long time extension educator in Penn, well, the Penn State Extension System, Pennsylvania, uh, operating as one of their small ruminant specialists for, I think, north of 30 years now. You had this idea. We felt that there was interest, and it was one of the last workshops that y'all be a part of, at least as a Penn State employee, is move into some different things here in work related, personal life. But yeah, I think well attended, and in terms of reaction and results that we had of knowledge gain, people found it significant. Uh, a significant resource, especially going into the winter months where we're feeding more stored feed items, whether it's hay or grain. So, as you mentioned, you attended that workshop.
Yep.
Uh, what was your overall thought in going? Why did you want to sign up? And then, I guess, what was your thought of it after the fact?
Well, for me, knowledge is always a good thing. And definitely didn't know how. I mean, I just had a rough idea like how you would mix forages together, or not forages, but grains or whatever together to come up with a ration. But I guess maybe I hadn't thought about exactly how you. Well, I have thought about it, but how you plug those numbers in and how you come up with it. And I've looked at some of these ration balancers, and they didn't make a lot of sense to me. And even reading the directions, they didn't make a lot of sense to me. But going through that class, you guys put up like two or three different ration balancers that you could use, and you literally just plug it in your numbers. And for instance, the energy that's in corn, the TDA, the protein that's in corn, and the protein that's in like soybean meal, and so you can just start playing around with the combinations of those two items to come up with 12%, 14%, 16% feed. And I didn't exactly know how to do that before, and so it's
Yeah,
always been here on this farm. It's always been weird. And then when we were running cattle all the time, we'd have corn, we'd have oats, we'd have spelts, sometimes we'd have wheat. And I always wanted to know what's the best combinations of those feeds that I can make the best kind of a top dressing feed to, feed. We were feeding corn salads back then, but what we could feed that on top of it. And everybody I would talk to said, well, you could use your corn, but I'd buy beet pulp. And it was always, they always wanted to add in all these other things that I didn't have.
right, right. Yeah, and that's some of the fun things in discussion, and a lot of people have those same questions, Tom, that you just mentioned. And I think that's where, when we think about nutrition, we know the value of feeding those animals, whether it's in 100% forage diet, fresh pasture and maybe some hay during those winter months for a short period of time, or we're actually mixing up some additional supplementation to give to those ewes. We all know that nutrition is important. And so we'd like to pay attention to it. And I think probably as livestock producers as a whole, especially sheep producers, we lack some of the basic skills to really understand what's going on. And to your point, knowledge is a good thing. So
Yeah.
so finding a way to go out and educate yourself, whether it's just personally reading and playing around with some stuff or going to a workshop, an event like that, uh, can be beneficial. But looking at those combination feeds, and we had a question at that second workshop. Um, you'd mentioned some of those small grains. We get some higher crude protein values on a lot of those, higher crude protein values than what we're going to have on our whole shelled corn. But the question was asked at the one event, like, well, if rye, or I'm sorry, triticale grain was 14% crude protein, and the question was, well, if it's already 14, we're trying to mix up a 14% crude protein ration, and that's a lot of times that's the first thing we look at. I'm not saying that's the right way to approach it, but we look at a feed tag, crude protein's there at the top.
Yep.
It's pretty easy to find. And the problem is if we're just evaluating off of that crude protein, are we providing enough energy? Are we providing that calcium phosphorus ratio in the quantity if we're going with that single feed stuff? And there are some that go together very nicely and the numbers work out in a pretty clean fashion. And then, without truly balancing the ration, and it's a total ration. We want it to be a complete ration so that we can provide all of the nutrients and meet those requirements. If we don't know that we're giving up, something in another category, then we're feeding and not hitting what we need to maximize the production out of those ewes, out of those lambs.
Yeah, and that was one of the issues too that came up. Was you have to do, if you're going to be feeding hay, you need a hay test. You need to know what that hay is that you're feeding. And for a lot of
Yeah.
us, that gets to be difficult because we end up sourcing hay from a lot of different places. I know here in Western Pennsylvania, the recommendation always is to take uh, so many samples from so many different bales that all came out of the same field that were all baled on the same day. And here in Western PA, it's not uncommon for a hay field to only be 3 acres.
Right.
And so you're buying hay, even if you're buying it from the same producer, it might be out of 8, 10, 12, 15 different fields.
Yeah.
And you're not always sure when they bring the bales, what fields those come out of, what lots they are. And that gets to be difficult. And I think the other thing I can come up with is that you're going to have to pull some samples from a bunch of those, and you're going to have to just kind of average them out.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point. It's not, we're not raising dairy cattle, and so the dairy producer can't get away with buying that type of hay and having the variability, because it will change yield day to day to day.
Yep.
So it is a daily output that we're chasing in the dairy industry, and eh, we can't afford the same feed stuff, whether it's cash flow or what the situation is, that we see in those other industries. And so we tend to buy some poor quality hay compared to those other entities. And especially when we're buying in quantity, we're buying in bulk, we kind of get what we get. And at least, not saying it's the right mentality, certainly this year we went out and bought significant amount of hay compared to what we would have done in previous years. And very much the situation you're talking about of we were purposeful on our sampling, and took what we felt was an accurate sample across the whole set of bales. We didn't sample every single bale, but felt we had enough representation to give us the average that we needed to. And it's also, this is not lactation quality forage. And
Right.
so just knowing kind of what I'm offering in that mid to getting into some late gestation of how much this hay should meet requirements for mid gestation, but as we move into late gestation, when we're looking at maybe adding in some concentrates before we get enough grass to really take those ewes where they need to be, where what's the difference? What am I left with after that hay portion of the diet? What do I need to add to accomplish where I need to be? And that's it's important. And a lot of times I think we just buy it and we assume, well, we're going to spend a little bit more money because it's second cutting hay, and it could be as bad or worse than some of our first cutting, depending on how it was made and when it was made. So yeah, I think that's a great point. The value of and it's stuff we've all heard before.
Oh,
Going out and getting a going out and getting a hay test and how important it is. But by the time you go out and whether you have the probe or you got to go to the county office and get the probe and then send it off and pay your $30 or whatever you're paying for that test.
mhm.
It's inconvenience. There's costs associated with it, but it is so important.
It is because it gives you a baseline uh, to try to go by. I know back when we were running feeder calves, we would feed corn silage, and we went through the hassle of taking the cart that we were feeding. We would fill this cart up, and then we would go fork that out into a feed bunk. And we weighed like 10 of those carts, so we knew exactly what. So we had an average of what the carts weighed, and then at the end of the day, whatever they didn't eat, we'd sweep up, put back in the cart, run it back over the scale, and see how much they weren't eating. And so we knew what we were putting in those calves, and then we could come up with a ration to put on top, or a supplement to put on top of that feed, so we could have those calves growing and staying right around that 2.5 pounds of growth a day. And it just seems so much harder to do with sheep because it doesn't seem it yeah, it doesn't seem to matter what hay you feed, there's a gonna be waste. Now, when we're feeding in a barn, at the bunks, we can go back in and sweep up the hay that's left over and weigh that. It doesn't weigh much, but you got to wonder how much is going into the pens, that they're just pulling out. And so to get that ration just, I guess, perfect is almost impossible.
It is difficult, and certainly the waste side of things is. I remember early on raising sheep, the hay waste portion was just so frustrating.
Oh
And
yeah.
part of that was, we were making a lot of our own hay. So, uh, and a lot of times I was on the wagon. So I knew what it took to harvest that, the amount of work that it took to harvest that forage and put it in the barn.
Hmm.
Um, and even, with the round bales, it to the point where, we still last year we fed bales and bale feeders in the pens. But the year before that, we would fork off round bales into fence line feeders because I could limit my waste. And the nice thing as you start to grow and you increase sheep numbers and probably figure out what type of hay feeder really works for your operation and limits waste, the more sheep you have on that bale, the less waste you're going to have.
Yeah.
And we're to the point now, as long as it's relatively decent hay, in terms of palatability and lower weed inclusion in that, uh, the waste is minimal now. And again, that's it just came with the numbers.
Yeah.
And so, and you've transitioned now to feeding some large squares. Is that correct?
Yep. Yeah.
And
We're mostly feeding those, in the barn when we have sheep in the barn.
right, do you think they would hold up outside, in a hay feeder?
Oh, I don't know. It have to be a different kind of hay feeder.
Okay.
We use,
Right.
we have fed them outside. We take hog panels and we cut them so that they will, uh, we cut them into, 4 pieces. Well, it takes more than 2 hog panels, but we'll cut those into 4 pieces so that they fit directly over top of that bale. And, then cut the strings, and it bulges out. And that has cut down on waste. If you didn't have, I mean, if you just set that bale there with nothing around it, you'd have a mess. But,
Right.
but we look at that waste as part of, our bedding, that we're using. But,
Yeah.
but quite often with that, the holes are big enough in that sheep will stick their heads in, and don't have an issue with it, and they will eat inside there, so they're not wasting as much. They're not grabbing it, pulling it out. Whatever falls out of their mouth, they're not going to, go back and pick up. And as you said, the more sheep you have on that bale, the better job they do with it. We do seem to have, less waste with that. Now, feeding in the barn, we have this big cart that we got from Tractor Supply, and we put a bale on there. It's bale's longer than the cart, but we cut those strings and let some of that hay fall off, and then we save the strings and tie it back up, and wheel it, to another part of the barn. But and then we count flakes and we feed that off, and then I sweep that up a couple of times a day to encourage them to eat as much of that as possible. And um, if I can calculate it out right, I can get them to clean up probably better than 90% of that hay. They seem to do a pretty good job with it.
Yeah, and that, I mean, that's huge, is the utilization, especially as we're buying feed in and really figuring out. And I think we're going to do an episode here in the near future on, forage analysis, and actually dive into, when we're buying hay, or even if you're producing your own hay, positioning those bales where they need to be so that we can feed certain types of hay to
Yeah.
meet, we're using that hay efficiently. Maybe I produce some pretty decent first cutting hay. Well, we're gonna flip the script on this. We produced some pretty good first cutting hay. We got in early, and it was vegetative when we made it, meaning it hadn't headed out and gone to seed. And so we have, greater level of digestion in that, because it's hasn't lignified
Right.
in the majority of that plant. So have some of that hay. We test pretty decent, and then second cutting gets rained on a couple times, tedded out, but it's second cutting hay, and it doesn't test as high. But I feed my first cutting during gestation, or you know during maintenance, that was better hay,
Uh-huh.
and I feed my second cutting during lactation or late gestation, when really I should have flipped the two.
Yeah.
Um, and that's a very specific example to
Well,
prove a point, but
it's hard to break that mentality.
oh, it is.
That's
And
what it's been your whole life.
how often, if we're putting those bales outside, if we're putting them inside, the ability to label them and keep track of them,
Oh,
I
I know.
had as part of this workshop, you had some agronomy individuals come in and work on the hay test portion, and forage quality and forage selection. And it was interesting. A lot of the background is coming into, contributing to the dairy industry, and the comment was made because we had some questions on corn silage, and if we had the facilities to feed it, I would do it in a heartbeat, because
We're
it is.
gonna, I've talked to, I've got a couple of cousins that are in the dairy industry.
Yeah.
And I was just talking with one of them yesterday, and I said, probably in January, I'm going to start hitting them up for some corn silage. Now, it's such a small amount. He just laughs. He thinks it's funny.
Right.
Yeah.
How far away do you have to go to pick it up?
About 3 miles. It's not, it certainly isn't horrible.
Okay, that's not
And
bad.
depending on with corn silage, for anybody that doesn't know, the big thing is once it's exposed to air, it starts to mold. and it doesn't take very long, but it is dependent upon the temperature. So if you're below
The
freezing, it
the environmental temperature.
right, the environmental
Yeah.
temperature, yeah, not the temperature of the silage. But so if you're below freezing, you could have a little pile of it sitting on a trailer or something, and it would last 3 or 4 days. You wouldn't have an issue with it. But if it's 65 degrees out, it's gonna by the next day it's gonna have mold on it, and you really need to be careful with it. But so we're thinking we're just gonna run up there and get a couple skid loader buckets of it and come down and fork that off into a wheelbarrow and take it in the barn and feed it to sheep and see if that makes just to see if it's feasible at all. I
Right.
don't know. Might be a lot of pulling around for nothing, but
Yeah,
the
and I think
typically the uh I think the NDF is a lot lower in that corn silage than it is in a lot of your say first cotton hay, and the energy should be a lot higher in that as well.
yeah, and it's crazy to me, when you're looking at corn silage, do you know what that largest portion of energy, what it should be coming from? Do you know what it should be coming from when we're cutting that whole plant?
I would think it would be the corn.
Yeah, it's coming from the kernel, and
Yeah.
it's amazing to me because we're I look at a corn stalk, yet the whole plant,
Hmm.
and we go through and we chop it up and essentially put it into the less than 2-inch pieces so it packs and ferments well, and the corn kernel makes up enough in what they would call well-eared
Yeah.
silage, that corn kernel and the cob, not the actual cob, but uh,
Ear.
the ear. Yes, thank you. That is the word I'm looking for. Makes up enough percentage of that plant's weight
Yeah.
that it actually contributes that much energy. Now, the downside to corn silage is the storage and the ease of feeding, but also the moisture content.
Right.
So we're not just feeding our 4 pounds as fed of dry hay.
Hmm.
We have to be able to feed 6-7 pounds of corn silage depending on stage of production and what that corn silage is testing at, and that's as fed, 6-7 pounds as fed, and you've got to deliver 6 to 7 pounds to them
Yeah.
as fed, and
Yeah.
you're delivering. So even in your transportation, you're transporting water,
Hmm.
and everybody knows that transporting water can get expensive. But I do, and this is not like people listen to this, don't take this and say, "Oh, they said you could do this and it wouldn't spoil." But I do wonder in your situation, and especially because it's close, but you still have a little bit of travel. I'd be curious looking at some like 55-gallon drums, and especially when the weather's cooler, could you get it in the drums, put them on a wagon, put the lid back on those drums, and how long would it can we slow down the negative effects of
I
oxygen
think
hitting that by
I would think you could probably slow it down, but you're going to have to pack it because you're going to have to pack the air out of it.
and it may be more work than what it's worth.
I would think. My
Yep.
my thought is, they feed a TMR, so they've got a big loader. They're loading into that, or just well, it's just a skid loader with a fairly good bucket on it. And I'm thinking I'll just go up there in the morning when they're doing their TMR, and I'll just have them dump a skid loader bucket on a small trailer, and I'll just bring it home and feed it.
Right. Now, are you going to feed that to open ewes, gestating ewes, or
My thought
lactation?
is late gestation ewes.
Okay.
That's the thought.
Right.
And we're playing around with the idea. We've got a lot of forage that's here close to the barn, and we're playing around with the idea of because I like to feed them a pound of corn per head per day 30 days before they lamb. And so we're playing around with the idea of having them on pasture, come into the barn to eat that grain and go back out on pasture. And
I mean, I would do that clear up until like, safe window before lambing.
well,
Just from a
that's exactly what we're thinking of doing. That would keep us out of hay. We wouldn't be feeding as much hay. Um,
yeah.
and then maybe with the lambing groups, then maybe we can start into the corn silage, or maybe we start the corn silage a little bit before that. I don't know. It's you know, it's an up in the air thing. We like so much everything else I do.
Right, right, and that's where, you have to be purposeful and have intention in stockpiling some of those forages.
Yeah,
If you want the ones close to the barn, I mean, I would run them to that, maybe 140 days. You could run them outside, and then, and it's weather dependent, but you're looking at them pretty frequently, and they're right there
yeah,
outside of the barn. So if you have something that starts to go early, you can catch it before it's a disaster. But for me, it would be more so from I guess two things: health. Getting if my ventilation isn't as good as what I'd like it to be
hmm
in that barn, that transmission of disease and ammonia buildup, I'm going to reduce that significantly if I've got those sheep outside. The other aspect of it, exercise.
yeah,
Those ewes getting out and moving, that's good for them.
yeah.
You have some friends that run some sheep that also have border collies, and border collies that are well trained and listen. So,
Yeah.
so the
As
threat of
opposed to my border collie.
right. So the threat of that border collie doing damage doesn't exist.
Yeah.
But they've brought up the point that they enjoy to get those ewes. They enjoy getting those ewes out and working those ewes,
Mhm.
gently working,
Yeah.
late gestating ewes with that dog to get some exercise on them that they wouldn't be getting normally.
Yep.
And they're already going to have to work the dog. That dog needs that job to do. So it's kind of two birds with one stone. And I think we've got the majority of sheep, especially when we're lambing in the winter, and you're talking some January, February
Yeah.
lambing, correct?
Yep.
So when we're thinking like those winter ewes, I think we end up getting some pretty lazy ewes in those winter groups
Mhm.
because weather, the environment in which they're sitting at. So yeah, I think that has some value, getting out on grass and moving, and then certainly the feed costs. The other one for me would be bedding. We're buying in straw and not complaining because we can get large quantities relatively inexpensive, and a lot of people can.
Yeah.
But uh, but I still don't want to use more than I need to
Yeah.
when we're talking about just additional expense to the operation. And then there's probably, I mean, it's a domino effect. The more manure is inside, the more you have to haul
Yep.
more often.
Yep.
And if those sheep go out and distribute it in the field for you, it's one less labor expense on your end.
Absolutely.
So yeah, I mean, I think that sounds like a great idea.
Yeah, it's something we're
The
gonna
corn
try. I don't
silage,
know how well it'll go, but we'll see what happens. I haven't been
could
given
you
a price yet on the corn salad either, so we'll see
okay.
how that plays into it.
Yeah.
That may be way more expensive than I want to do, but I've been
Could
wanting
you
to try it for
start
a long time. What's that?
could you start with some wet wrapped hay? Do you have access to any of that?
Not at this point. I just talked to a guy I don't know, 2 days ago. He wanted $60 a bale, but he wasn't sure how many he was gonna have.
Okay. And were
So
those round bales or
yeah,
big
yeah,
squares?
those were rounds.
Okay. Because
And
I've even thought, the big squares, wet wrapped, can we treat that as almost like a mini silage bag?
yeah,
Does it stay tight enough? Can I cut that in half or in quarters as I need to and put that in front of there? And I think we're approaching the biggest thing is having the numbers to devour that
yeah,
literally devour that bale in a short period of time.
yep. That's the
And I
truth.
think we're approaching that number, but for a long time, it's and the average producer doesn't have the U numbers to justify that.
Hmm.
Um, and that makes it difficult. But that product, when I'm talking wrapped ham, I'm talking actual like ensiled
Right.
bales,
Right.
not necessarily the 28% moisture, like in between hay,
Yeah.
but the 45, 50% dry matter or moisture content,
Yeah.
uh, wrapped and then goes through a hard, serious fermentation process.
Yep.
But yeah, the longer you can keep those ewes on grass, the better off you are. And then certainly, we were talking on that nutrition end of things. The other point that was brought up when we're thinking about silage, especially, is taking multiple forage analysis, forage tests
Hmm.
for feed analysis as we work through that silage, because we can't take that nutrient test early on, that
Yep.
forage quality test early on, and then feed it 6 months later because things change.
Yeah. Well,
And
the,
it's the
the good
same.
news with these guys is they're working with nutritionists, so they're having tests done quite often.
Yeah. And I would say the same with our hay.
Yeah.
If we go to a hay auction and they've got a forage test from the week after it was made versus how it's going to feed 9 months later,
Yeah.
it can change a little bit, not
That's true.
drastically. Now, if we put them outside and maybe they're twine tied bales on some larger rounds, that begins to change pretty quickly.
Yep.
But it's something to be aware of and consider. So, from that workshop, Tom, do you feel that you've got a ration that you'd like to try that you feel is balanced and you're pleased with?
Eh,
Okay. Okay.
kinda. It's just
Nice.
something just kind of mull around in the head. Just still thinking about it. Uh,
Right.
I did like in that ration balancer. You can actually put in what it costs you per pound,
Yes.
and it'll give you a number. Um,
Right.
and so driving home, I'm thinking, well, I need to look into whatever different feedstuffs I can come up with and see if I can find a ration that will work, give me what I want, and be cheap. So we'll just have
Right.
to play with those numbers and see what we come up with.
And we probably should mention that these are free programs, open access that they were using in the workshop, and anybody has access to. And that's through, I think you can find a bunch of them on that Maryland sheep and goat page.
Yes.
And under, I think, apps, I think there's an apps tab on there. And the ones that we were using were the ration balancer and then also the ration evaluator, which are both Maryland products. And then the one that I use personally and like quite a bit because it balances for the individual animal and then you just extrapolate out of that is the Montana State University
Hmm.
ration balancer program. And that has a login and will save your multiple rations. And more so just from a playing around
Yeah.
standpoint, it's kind of fun to throw some different things in there. I also like from a resource, and this is not a plug for uh, their product, but I mean it's free. So if you want to use it, it's out there. But it has all your nutrient requirements on those animals. And so there's some other resources on there outside of
Yeah.
the balancing
Yeah.
of the ration. Um, we certainly, the second one, not the one you were at, Tom, but had some interesting. That was in the eastern part of the state of Pennsylvania, and so had some different, feed stuff questions. Some individuals coming, you're driving a little bit out of some more northeastern states,
Uh-huh.
and had questions like Milo,
Yeah.
sorghum grain, uh, because they're feeding it quite a bit in the poultry industry.
Yeah.
Um,
That's part of
like,
the fun of this is there's a lot of different options.
oh yeah, there's everything,
Yeah.
and
Well,
then
we're coming up on our time here, Cam.
really, that was
Yeah.
a fast one.
Yeah, it is. So it's been good catching up with you. And I'd
You
like to
too,
thank everybody
Tom.
for listening to the Grazing Sheep podcast. If you want to reach out to us, you can. There's a Facebook page. You can leave a message there, or you can get a hold of me at bigtomperkins@gmail.com. So you have a fun rest of your day there, Cam, and we'll catch up with you later.
I'm gonna try. Have a good
All right.
one.
All right. Bye.